Many people think that vibe coding and agentic engineering are rival approaches, but they're really just two ends of one spectrum. And I think the real skill is knowing where to stand for a given project. Hi, I'm Mirko. I've been coding for about 40 years, 30 of those professionally, both as an engineer at startups and Google, as well as a senior engineering manager. And these days, I'm working on my own projects with the assistance of AI on a daily basis. So let me tell you why I'm enthusiastic about AI-assisted coding. I learned how to program over 40 years ago, back when things felt simple and direct. I taught myself BASIC on my Commodore 64, and I remember the joy I felt when I saw the first pixels appear on the screen after typing in some what felt like cryptic commands into the computer. From there, I moved on to other learning languages, Logo, Pascal, and so on. I worked with assembler, C++, Java, Ruby, Python, many other languages. I learned how to do web development, server-side development, work with databases, microservices. And one pattern that's been pretty clear over the decades that I've worked with software is that things tend to oscillate between simple solutions and more complex solutions, right? So for example, I spent about 10 years working with Java. There were a lot of pretty heavyweight frameworks like struts. There was XML everywhere, and it honestly was kind of tedious. And then Ruby on Rails came along, and it was a breath of fresh air. It brought the focus back to the business logic with minimal boilerplate in between. But then shortly afterwards, web development evolved in a much more complex direction again, right? We had single-page applications, complex JavaScript frameworks, dealing with state management and hydration and server-side rendering and all of these things. So my point is that simplicity and complexity have kind of pendulumed my whole career, and I know what a good swing feels like. And in my opinion, we're in the middle of one right now, driven by AI. AI kind of collapsed the distance between an idea and the working thing again. It almost brought back that kind of pixels on the monitor feeling. Now, I know this might sound a little bit like old man yelling at clouds, back in my day, but I'm actually not nostalgic for the simplicity. I honestly feel that AI gave the simplicity back. I also realize that a lot of senior developers feel like AI-assisted coding takes something away from them, and I get it, right? You've spent years, maybe decades, honing those particular skills. You're proud of them, and you enjoy it as a craft. There's nothing wrong with that. I totally respect that. But for me personally, I feel like AI actually gave something back by letting me focus on the ideas, what I want to build, and reducing the complexity of getting there. So all of these different ways for us to engage with AI coding tools didn't appear overnight, right? We first had simple chat assistants like ChatGPT. Then we got smarter autocomplete in IDEs, tools like Cursor or GitHub Copilot. And then finally, agentic command line tools like Claude Code or Codex. So there's now this whole spectrum of ways to work with these AI tools. Anything from smart autocomplete to fleets of autonomous agents doing tons of stuff in parallel, and everything in between. So let's talk about this spectrum here. On the one end of it, we have vibe coding. Andrej Karpathy actually coined that term in early 2025. And with vibe coding, the focus tends to be purely on the result. There's no care for the underlying code or architecture. It doesn't require a computer science degree or an engineering background, and that's a feature. And I actually love it. I'm genuinely excited how it empowers non-engineers to build stuff. There's no judgment there. But it does come with its limitations. So for one thing, you can't necessarily trust that it holds up because you've never examined the architecture. There might be subtle bugs or edge cases that you're not accounting for. You might hit nasty scaling surprises once you're rolling this out to tens of thousands of users. So it's very risky to, say, build a SaaS tool and charge money for it if you don't know what the internals look like, right? It also usually doesn't age well. The structure of the app kind of hardens early, and then every new feature gets bolted on the outside until you're eventually scared to touch it. That doesn't mean that vibe coding doesn't have a lot of very good use cases. It's perfect for throwaway one-off tools, or maybe for quick proofs of concepts, right? To understand if an idea even has legs before you invest more time and energy into it. It's a great tool for product managers, designers, and other roles to build interactive mockups, essentially, that help finalize the product requirements and communicate with engineers. It's also fun to just quickly whip something up. It's really empowering. And whipping up these little one-off tools used to be prohibitive in terms of opportunity cost. Let me just give you one quick example. I'm building a course right now, so I recorded many hours of video, and I also want to make sure that my course has solid captions, right? Subtitles. These days, video editing tools have pretty decent transcription features that can automatically come up with captions based on the audio. However, they tend to make a lot of mistakes. So for example, in my course, I say Claude a lot, right? As in the LLM or Claude Code. And DaVinci Resolve, my video editing tool, often transcribed it as Cloud. Maybe it's just my German accent, but that's just one of many examples. So what I did is I vibe coded a simple captions cleanup tool. I gave it a bunch of context about the course that I'm building to ground it in the terminology that I'm using, and then used LLMs to actually read my captions file and clean them up based on what I likely really meant. I even added a automated reviewer step that sort of called out some fixes that I should maybe take a look at just to make sure. And it worked perfectly well. I now have much, much better captions that I can use in my course. So if I had had to build this from scratch, it wouldn't have been worth it, without AI. But with AI, it was maybe an hour or two, and I'm glad I have this tool now. So let's talk about the other end of the spectrum, agentic engineering. And actually, Karpathy coined this term as well about a year later. And many other people have adopted it now, including myself. Agentic engineering stands for essentially being intentional about what you do, both the architecture and the code. It means you're working towards a specific solution, a specific direction. You're reviewing the code along the way. You're catching bugs. You're making sure that you have solid test coverage. Now, I also want to talk about what agentic engineering is not. If you listen to a lot of YouTubers, you'd think that you need fleets of agents and Ralph loops to do this seriously. And honestly, you don't. The whole point of agentic engineering is intentionality, which requires time and attention to actually look at the output and steer it. So running more agents in parallel actually means that you're giving less attention to each one. And your attention is really the value that you're adding with this approach. Flashy setups optimize for output speed, which is fair, but it's the opposite of what makes this work. So, if I'm being honest, most of the time, I actually work single-threaded. I work on one feature at a time, and I don't find output speed really to be a significant limitation. Also, modern tools like Claude Code or Codex actually spawn sub-agents under the hood and automatically parallelize where it makes sense. So I don't actually have to architect that myself. So an example of a project where I've employed agentic engineering is my Gamma Vibe daily startup idea pipeline, right? So this is an autonomous AI pipeline that reads hundreds of news articles, extracts business signals, synthesizes ideas, and then writes a newsletter post about a specific startup idea. So with this, I put a lot of thought into the pipeline architecture from the beginning, at least the shape of it, right? That doesn't mean that I built the complex pipeline I have now immediately. I still started with something reasonably simple. I didn't have a database at first. I just used JSON artifacts. And the pipeline was much more rigid, much more sequential in nature. And then once I had a proof of concept working, I quickly pivoted, added database support, essentially added this database state-based architecture. Anyway, I was very intentional about what I'm building, what the architecture should look like. I reviewed the code, I found some bugs, I revised it as needed. And this is something that I couldn't have built with pure vibe coding, at least not in a way that actually holds up in production like this pipeline does. So vibe coding and agentic engineering, they're not binary choices. It's a spectrum. And you need to be intentional about where you operate for any given project. If you're building a quick proof of concept, you're probably operating far on the vibe code end of the spectrum. Same with a throwaway tool. If you're building a production system that needs to hold up to, many thousands of users and you're charging money for it, you probably want to be pretty far on the agentic side of the spectrum. For most real work that you're doing, you're probably somewhere in the middle. Honestly, that's where I operate most of the time. I might have the rough shape of the solution in mind, but I don't necessarily review every line of code in detail. So really the skill isn't picking a side, it's reading the project and choosing your spot on the spectrum deliberately. Now, a quick pitch about my course. This whole video is about being intentional on the agentic end. And the Agentic Pipeline course is the systematic version of that. In the course, you'll learn how to build an autonomous AI pipeline like the one that I'm using for Gamma Vibe. And you'll build it using agentic engineering techniques, using your AI coding tool of choice. So if that sounds interesting, you can find the link in the description. I'm in the final stages of getting the course up. In the meantime, you can download the blueprint, and that also gets you added to the waitlist. And that way you can make sure to get the launch discount when I launch it in the next week or two. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any feedback. Write a comment about where you tend to operate on this spectrum, what's working well for you. Thanks, and see you next time.